All right, today we are looking at Greek and Roman art. So first I want to start off with the themes for each of these. We'll look at Greece first. So we'll do Greek art here. With Greek art, the themes that we're going to examine today are going to be arete, which is a Greek word for excellence. And this was this belief in showcasing the idealized body, the best possible potential of a human, usually male. Rather than female, you have a little bit of that, but this is almost always with Greece in general. They did not look on women that favorably, and so most of these are going to be focused on men and their role that way. Women were kind of an afterthought in many cases within Greece. It was probably one of the least likely places you would want to time travel to if you were a woman. As far as what you were capable of doing, except for Sparta, which was a little bit different than the rest of Greece. So arete is excellence, and then an idealized sense, the best possible version one could be. Gods and myths is going to be another theme that we're going to examine. Strength and athletics. There's a lot of examples of men doing a sport. And then realism comes into play just in the Hellenistic period. So the other ones you see in various ways. Arete and idealized is mostly classical. So there is some separation depending on the period, which we will look at. And realism is largely Hellenistic. And then for Roman art, they have some differences there with a few similarities. One that's definitely uniquely Roman is military. There was a lot of emphasis on showcasing military structure. Civic Roman duty. The idea that as a Roman you had a duty to Rome and Rome as the main purpose and goal. There was a sense of individualism as well in their art, which did go against the idea of like Rome above the self. So we'll look at that. And then propaganda. More so, you don't have that sense of propaganda in the Greek art, but with the Roman Empire, you do. So we'll put this with the Roman Empire because that definitely comes into play a lot more once there are emperors than during the Republic. So what we were going to start with then is Greek history, and then we'll look at Roman art and Roman history and art after. So before we get into the art, we have to just have a really brief background. And sorry, I'm just going to have to keep moving this picture down until we get to that, if it lets me here. So you need to have a little bit of background in order to understand how the art is coming into play, because it definitely is part of that. So there are three periods of Greek history, I guess 4 if you included the Dark Ages, but there was no art coming out of that period. So the first is the Archaic, and the Archaic period was from 650 to 480 BCE. And then you have the Classical, which was from 480 to 323 BCE. And then the last was the Hellenistic period. Now each of these periods, and that was from 323 to 27 BCE. So each of these periods, like I said, is going to influence the style of art and what's going on. The Archaic period is really the early developments of Greece. So what you actually get within the Archaic period was a development of city-states. Greece was not, they didn't identify as a singular group, like as Greece, as we would identify them today. Instead, what happens in the Archaic period is that they develop into independent city-states. So this is where you have like Athens or Sparta, right? Those are the two main ones that are the largest powers in Greece at the time. But there was Corinth, Argos, and so on and so on. And you identified with your city-state over anything else, and they fought. There were definitely battles. There's going to be the whole Peloponnesian War, which is a fight really between Athens and Sparta. And while they do come together with the Persian Wars and begin to identify as the Hellenes, which is kind of their word for what we would use as the Greeks, the identity of your city-state was far more important. So the Archaic period was actually that development of that type of identity, and for Sparta, it was the development of their culture as a warrior society. For Athens, it was transitioning to democracy. Now, they don't become a democracy till the classical period, but you have a series of changes to the government during the Archaic period. So it really is a development period in that sense. The next one then for classical is the classical period is at the height of power for both Athens and Sparta. So this is when they're at their strongest and they're, well, really their wealthiest and most powerful. You come off of this with the success of the Persian War, the identity of themselves really secured and developed at this point. Let's see, I thought I would insert this ahead of time so that it would be easy to have in, but now it's kind of being a pain. So I apologize for that, but we'll get that in there. The classical period with Athens is important, and we're not going to talk about Sparta as much simply because they didn't produce a lot of art. Sparta was a militaristic society. Sparta, from a very young age, as a boy, you were taken away and you were trained in the barracks as a professional soldier, and your life was centered around that. It created an amazingly strong military force, but they lacked in art and development because their entire focus and value was the military. For Athens, the classical period is when they become a democracy. And this is important because this is going to shape a lot of the early art. In this period, you have, so we'll stick with this as the classical. We're really looking at Athens here. This is an optimistic period where they were, again, at their height of power. They were successful. They had shifted to a democracy. And so you have this idea of, which we mentioned with that theme, arete, which is going to come in, of excellence. The idea of the best that you can achieve. And that really was part of this idea with democracy, of bettering oneself in education and art and philosophy and all those areas. And the art is going to, from the classical period, the sculptures is going to reflect that type of sentiment. And then with the Hellenistic period starts with the death of Alexander, Alexander the Great. Although you do see some changes happening while he is still alive. So Alexander the Great, he conquered all of not only Greece, except for Sparta and Persia, and had a massive empire. this was seen as the end of independent democratic state for Athens, and they didn't particularly like Alexander the Great. After his death, his empire is split into a lot of different kingdoms. And it's split into several different kingdoms because his generals end up fighting and taking over various parts of his larger empire because he refused to name a successor. And this created a lot of anxiety. You have a lot of fighting that's going on, and we'll say fear as well, fighting and fear, and as well as wealth. So there were some positives, as there was an increase in wealth and an increase in women's rights. These things, though, were coupled with, again, the anxiety, the fighting, and fear, and you see that reflected in the art as well. So just keep that in mind as far as that the time period and what is going on with Greece at the time, whether it's the Archaic, where they're developing their identity, whether it's the classical period, where they're at their height and they're the most optimistic, or whether it's the Hellenistic period where things are more chaotic, you see in the sculptures those different developments. Okay, so what we're going to look at first in art is going to be temples. Temples were an important part of every city-state. In fact, every large city-state had an Acropolis. And the Acropolis was part of a series of buildings that housed sometimes one to several temples. The Acropolis was a complex of buildings, so it wasn't just one building. Instead, it was a series of buildings. It was almost always built on the highest ground in the city, and this was not only to showcase power and to be seen, but also for protection as well. So you have it both as what could be considered protection, as well as visibility. Right? It was meant to be where anyone in the city could look to it as kind of the central area. It was a religious complex for that city-state. The most famous, put that one over here, the most famous Acropolis and temple would be the Parthenon. So the Parthenon was in Athens. This was the temple to Athena, which was the patron deity of Athens. Now, a patron deity is an individual deity for a specific city or city-state. So a lot of times in history, the Mesopotamians had patron deities, the Greeks had patron deities, the Romans had patron deities, gods specific to that city. Now, the Athena was a god within the main Olympians, and other city-states recognized her and worshipped her as a god too, but she was like the favored god of the city. So a patron deity, that god it was kind of seen like that was the god's responsibility to kind of look after that city-state. It was the favored god of that particular city, and so in the Acropolis of each city-state, they tended to have a temple to their patron deity. In Athens, with their Acropolis, it was the Parthenon. Once it was rebuilt after the end of the Persian War, because the Athens was pretty much destroyed during the Persian War by the Persians, and so they rebuilt. They had a previous temple to Athena. The Parthenon was basically a larger version of that that temple. So it was rebuilt. It also was So rebuilt after the Persian Wars. It was also used as a way to collect money, or a war treasury. So why it was not used as a war treasury before the Persian Wars. But what happens with this is that you have, with the Persian Wars, the Greeks won, at a loss to Athens in some ways, of the city being destroyed in parts. But they were successful in kicking the Persians out. There was fear by the various city-states that Persia would come back. And so the Athenians created the Delian League. And what they did is they said, let's all band together, and you'll pay essentially taxes or tribute, which will go into the war fund for them specifically to build ships. The Athenians were amazing naval force, and that was seen as the best bet against the Persians. So these various smaller city-states that couldn't defend themselves in case the Persians came back gave money to the Delian League, and that money was stored in the Parthenon. The Parthenon and the Acropolis was also, besides being as a religious city or center of the city, was also a gathering place for meetings. So and we could obviously religious functions as well. So there were several purposes that the Acropolis had and the temples had, as far as how they were used during that time. So the structure of, and we have some pictures we'll look at in just a minute, of the Parthenon itself. It was made of white marble. Now, one of the things that's a misconception with Greek art is that all of their statues and temples were meant to be this kind of naturalistic white marble. And that's not the case. They were made of marble, but they painted them, and actually painted them in very bright colors. Over time, that has worn off, and then there were some early archaeologists that actually scrubbed it off as well. And so we get this image in our head, and even to this day, even though I know they painted them bright colors, I envision and see in my head the sculptures as this natural marble, because that's what we've been inundated with. But they kind of were actually, I don't think they looked nicer that way, but they liked colors, and they painted them. So the temple was painted, the sculptures we're going to look at were all painted. What we see left today is just the marble. So while made with white marble, it was painted. Red was one of the main colors for the columns, and then you had the reliefs on the frieze area, which I'll show, which was also painted as well. It was designed specifically to epitomize ideal proportions. That was an important part of classical Greece, and this was built in the classical period. So it's not surprising that they used those same ideas that we're going to see on the sculptures, right? This goes back again to that arete, that excellence and idealized sense of wanting it to be the best possible example that it can be. In the middle, well, you had several statues of Athena in the Acropolis and the Parthenon itself. There was one specifically very large statue of Athena in the center of the Parthenon. And that was in part because it was a temple to her. And then it combined two types of columns and styles of architectural style. We're going to look at those, and that's what this image that we finally got to was here. So there are three types of column styles, which then are reflective of the architectural style. You have Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. So in order to look at and understand these three, I wanted to kind of just have this image here so we could break down the different parts that we're going to be talking about. So you have the very top part, and this, you know, if you were going to continue drawing down, you'd have the column that would go the rest of the way here, and then you would have the base, and then you would have a larger bottom part that it would be on. That was usually a couple layers. So this is an entablature is the top part. I'll write it a little bit bigger because it's kind of small. So you have the entablature contains all of these parts right here that rests on top of the capital and the column. So this is the basically the top part of the building. Then you have, so that's the top part. Then you have the capital, and the capital is this top part of the shaft or column. And that is what the entablature, all of the entablature parts rest on top. So that's this part right here. And this is an important part. If you're trying to identify, helpful in identification of what type. If you're trying to identify, is it Doric, is it Corinthian, is it Ionic? The capital is one of the main giveaways for that. So that's an important part. Now, all of it helps identify, but if you're looking for a quick identification, like how do I tell quickly, look for the capital, and you should be able to identify it. And we're going to look at some examples of that. And then you have the shaft, and the shaft is the column itself, the actual column. And then you have right here, which looks like a capital on the bottom, is the base. So it's the bottom piece, the bottom part of the shaft, right? Because then you do have this other part, but we're not going to talk about that part, but that's the foundation essentially. So those are the four areas that of a column and of an architectural building in Greek art that you want to know, and Roman art too. The entablature, the capital, the shaft, and the base. So what I want to look at with this is then the three types, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and look at their characteristics. So Doric, did I say Dorian? If I did, I apologize. Dorian is actually part of the Greeks as well, but something a little bit different. The Doric part, there are some characteristics. Again, I'm going to explain these, and then we're going to go look at some of the examples. There are some key characteristics that make something a Doric column. One of the things is it's usually the simplest style. So if you're looking at the columns and you see there's not a lot of extra there, it's most likely to be Doric. It's stouter and larger with the column itself. It also was the oldest type. That doesn't help you identify it, but just to know that it's the oldest of the three. They tend to have rounder capitals. So if you go back to this part here, where it shows the capital, that tends to be more round, as well as simplistic itself, part of that. For the entablature part, So these parts here tend to be what you notice with these top two here, because the oldest type isn't one of them. That's going to be with the shaft. Oops. Then you have the capital, and then the last part with the entablature. You have in the entablature, you have what are called triglyphs. And then you also have another part, which is the metope, which is these. So these two are located in the entablature. And those are the triglyph and metope. It's not two E's, it's one. Metope. These are the design essentially in the frieze, so that you have on top of the column, there's usually this portion here, and it has these, the triglyph is this part on either side, and then in the middle is the metope, which is usually a figure or relief in between. So those are the characteristics of Doric. I'm going to explain all three, and then we'll go look at some of the images, both of the Acropolis, the Parthenon specifically, and these three types of columns. So the next one is Ionic. And with Ionic, you have a column base, or the shaft base. So the Doric ones tend to not have a base, right? We have shaft, capital, and entablatures, no base. And then you have, there tends to be scroll-like capitals. Then you'll see they look like scrolls. And then in the entablatures, you have the frieze, which has the reliefs and statues. Well, they're not statues, but they're reliefs in that region. So this is the entablature. The last one, Corinthian. The Corinthian one was used occasionally by Greeks, but was more often used by the Romans rather than the Greeks. The Corinthian one has acanthus leaves on the capital, so that's a dead giveaway, is that you will see you have these leaves for the capital. And the other part has a mixture of the entablatures and things like that used by the Romans. So the capital. What's significant about the Parthenon is that they use two types of columns, right? We talked about that here, and I gave the three types. The two that they used were the Doric and the Ionic, and that was unusual because most of the time Greek architecture only used one. So the Parthenon was unique because they used both Doric and Ionic. All right, so let's look at some of the images here so that we can get a visual of how this was set up. So here you have the three Greek and Roman columns that I was talking about. So you can see the Doric is the first one. If you notice, right, there's no base here. It just goes straight into the support, the foundation. And then you have the shaft and the column itself. These tend to be wider, and you can see with the shaft in this diagram here that it's wider and larger, or stouter as a descriptor for it, than the Ionic or the Corinthian. So when you see that larger style of column or shaft, that's usually a giveaway. And then you have the capital right here, and it's more that simplistic and rounded style. There's not a lot of style to the capital in the Doric structure. And then you have the entablature, right? And here's what I'm talking about with the triglyphs are right here. And then the center part is where it doesn't have it in this diagram, but the center part is where there would be reliefs. So you would have it would keep going, and there would be the metopes in between the triglyphs. And they would repeat. It would be a repeating order of things, right? It wasn't just one. It would go through the whole side of the building. The Ionic is next, and here you can see the capital right away. It's this kind of reverse scroll-like structure. See how it curls? Well, this looks like a scroll. If you flipped it around and you were rolling out the scroll, this is what a scroll would look like. So that's an easy way to identify, again, is look at the capital. If you go over to the Corinthian one, these are the acanthus leaves. As I mentioned, right, they're pretty obvious. So if you were given and said to identify each type of column, look for the capital first, and then look at everything else, because you just from the capital, you might be able to figure out what it is right off the bat. You can see with the Ionic one, here's the base. As you can tell, right, there's no base for the Doric one. So that is also an easy way to at least identify Doric versus not. As you can see, the Corinthian one has a base as well. It's thinner than the Ionic order most of the time, but it's similar enough that that's a harder distinguish. Where you can easily distinguish it is between Doric and Ionic is where's the base. No base, base. Okay, if there's no base, then you know it's the Doric, especially if you have the capital. That's simplistic as well. The triglyphs tend to be a feature of the Doric, and so that is if you look at the entablature next and you see the triglyphs and the metope, that also is a sign, right? Where you look with the Ionic, you have what's called the frieze, which is a series of reliefs, but you don't have, essentially it's the metope. You don't have any triglyphs. It's just a long series of usually more high relief. We could put that in there. I'll add that in, right? Low relief is where we looked at that before, where it's not very deep. It's pretty close to the actual material that it was carved from. High relief can almost look like actual in the round sculptures because of how much depth they have. And then the shaft is a little bit more narrow compared to the Doric. And then if you look at the Corinthian one, right, the leaves for the capital is the dead giveaway. You have a base as well. The shaft here is even just a little bit more narrow. So this one is the most narrow of the three. And then with the entablature, it does vary. One of the things that it tends to have is this pattern design. Oh, whoop, sorry about that. And that was my watch apparently thinking I said its name. You tend to have this design that goes on. So those are the three columns. That's what they look like. Here is the Acropolis in Athens. As I mentioned, right, it's at its highest point in the city. You have this very tall hill that they actually reinforced with stone. And then you have the Acropolis on top, which has the series of complexes. And then the center, with the one that's surviving, right? This is a modern picture. You have the Parthenon. And it was meant, again, anywhere from the city, you could look up and see the Acropolis. It was meant to be that visual, kind of like the pyramids in a way of showing that visual power, the religious piety, but also a secure stronghold to the city. And then here's the Parthenon itself. Here we have the Doric columns. So you can see right off the bat, here are the triglyphs and the metope, right, on the entablature. So you can, that's a giveaway right there, is looking for these triglyphs and metope that appear on the top, rested on the capital and the columns. And it goes, you know, it's almost always the whole length of the building itself. And then we can see the capital here, simplistic, right? There's not design, it's just the square. And then the wide, straightforward shaft. And then if we look over on the corner here, there's no base. So there is our identification of being able to see what a Doric column looks like. Now the next, and I mentioned, right, it's unique because you have two different types of columns used. That was the Doric. Here is the Ionic. Right here at the capital, we can see the scroll-like capital. And that is an easy giveaway. This one doesn't show the base, but it has a base too. And the up here, it's no longer exists, but this was the frieze. This was where you had, they actually are called the Elgin Marbles. This was a whole, and still is, a controversial thing. So again, this was where the frieze was, but it's not there anymore. The British Museum has they're called the Elgin Marbles. And they look like statues because they're high relief. And they were removed and taken to the British Museum not recently, a while ago. And this was kind of back when archaeology was take what you want from things. Elgin claimed they had permission to do so. The government later said they didn't. Greece wants them back. Probably because they'd like to put them in their own museum or help reconstruct them onto the Parthenon itself. And the British Museum obviously doesn't want to give them back. In fact, if the British Museum gave back everything that it took from various countries, they wouldn't have much of a museum left. And so there's a huge argument and debate about what are in art. Who has the right to have it? Does it need to go to the original owners? Or does it belong in a museum that has the best opportunity and stability to preserve it for people to see? And that hasn't been resolved. There are arguments on both sides. Think of an example: if you have a country that's constantly in war and is always at threat of either hostile people to art and history destroying the art, or selling it on the black market, or the museum being destroyed, versus a place that's secure, that isn't going to have anything happen to it, so that it can live on. And there are valid arguments on both sides, but that's why nothing is here. It was, the whole thing was removed. But that is a giveaway for the Corinthian, or not the Corinthian, sorry, the Ionic column style. And then here is an artist's reconstruction of what the Parthenon would have looked like, which then gives us an example to see on the front. So the front facing part of the Parthenon is where the Ionic columns were. And here's where you have what were the Elgin Marbles that were removed. This whole area was removed. They were all there. And then on the side, this is the Doric columns, and this is the Ionic columns. And that was what was unique, is to mix the two. And then you have the very large statue of Athena in the middle, which you could go and sacrifice and offer prayers to. Obviously it had a roof, and you had an outer walkway and then an intersection in several different rooms. So it was a very impressive building. All right, so that's what the columns and the Acropolis and the Parthenon looked like. So let me add on here with the frieze with Ionic high relief, right? Just to clarify and make sure that that was almost always the high relief. The next thing then that we're going to look at with Greek art before we get to the sculptures are their vases, which they were very well known for. The Greek pots were made in large workshops and both mass produced and yet individually produced. That you had this whole workshop, so it wasn't mass produced in the sense of the art being the same, but they had a whole factory system of producing these in large quantities because people used these vases. It was art, but they were also used in daily life. And it was so why they had to have such large workshops is because used in daily life, they produced a ton of vases. You had in the workshop a master potter and a master painter, and they had to work hand in hand to produce the vases because the way that the process was done is that the part of the painting and design was done in the process of making the pot itself or the vase. So the two work together. How the main structure and how it worked had to do with the firing process. So there were, and we'll talk about the firing process with the types. There were two main types of vases. The first was the black figures. And this is where the base of the vase, the main color of the vase was red. And the figures, that's why it's called black figures, were black. Okay, so how it was done is that in order to create these black figures, they used slip, which slip was watered down clay. And they used this slip to paint essentially the design on the pot. What they would do is that you would incise designs, or people, the drawings, the anything that you wanted to be the black part of the vase into the slip. And then you had a 3-phase firing process, right, where you stuck it in the kiln. That's what the firing process did. And within this 3-phase firing process, it eventually turned the slip covered areas into black. So thus why the potter, the master potter, and the painter had to work together. And then the rest of the pot, or vase, remained red. The second type of figure were the red figures, which, not surprisingly, it was just a reverse process of the black figure structure. So they just did the reverse of that process. One of the things that was the red figures created is that the red figures essentially on the black made them look more three-dimensional. And so artists took advantage of this by focusing a lot on facial expressions and hair, because you could see it in more detail. Now for for both of these vases, you have some specific topics that are looked at. You have a lot with the gods and myths. A lot of the vases have various themes like Hercules, Athena, Dionysus. Sometimes it was connected to the type of vase or pot. So if it was for water, it might have a different theme than like a wine jug. Often had Dionysus on it because he was the god of drink, along with a variety of other things, to the type of vase. And so they kept to a theme, essentially. But gods and myth was probably the most used theme. They also did some with war. So warfare. This could be either warfare and athletics. Well, we'll put them separately here. So warfare could either be myth, various mythical battles, or it could be or real ones. They probably tended to do a few more mythical battles than real, but you did have some real ones depicted as well. And then athletics, right? The Greeks were big on the Olympics, and if you're looking at the classical period, again, there is this emphasis on excellence, and athletes kind of exemplify that ideal. So let's look at a couple of these to see what they look like. Here we have the black figure vases. As you can see, here's one with warfare. This is also actually a mythical battle. So you have the red part of the vase, and then the slip was used on any of the areas to make it black. If you can see with the black on their faces, you cannot see as much detail when we're going to look at the red figure vases in a minute. You can see more detail, which is why then there was more focus. On the black, it's harder to see because it ended up making this shadow style to it. And you definitely have the positive and negative image going on here. And the type with the black figure, then you get more of an outline than the extreme detail. But the simple to identify, right? Black figure literally means they're a black figure. The people on the vase are black. And or whatever image is being drawn. If it's an animal, right, that would be black. If we go to the red figure vase, you can see the figure. This is Athena. So again, a god or goddess as a theme. Her face is more detailed, and they can play with even her dress. All of it is allowed to have more detail because of that somewhat three-dimensional style that's created from it. And here we can see the comparison of a black versus red figure vase. So the black one was the one we were looking at before, but you have the similar style of two soldiers sitting down at a table. But if you compare again, you can see their faces here. But if you look at the faces in the red figure, they are more detailed. In fact, it comes out just clearer again because of the positive negative image and the color play that's going on. The red figure pops more and provides more clear-cut detail than the black figure vases. But these were the two main vases that were used. And again, they were used in everything, in all kind of day-to-day life. People bought and used these vases, and it was more fun to have vases that had scenes from Greek mythology, day-to-day life, athletics, the Olympics, the different sports, right? That all created interesting images for people to have, and people bought and commissioned and had specific scenes made. So we can put that down too. Specific images made for families, right? So if they wanted, if the families identified with certain, myths or gods, they would sometimes have and commission vases to be made, especially the wealthier families, to reflect that. So next we're going to look at the sculptures, right? So we have the temples, the vases, and the sculptures. There's 3 periods, and the sculptures with 3 different periods. I'm going to go give the characteristics, and then we'll take a look. So the first is the Archaic Period, which, remember, the Archaic Period was a period of transition and development. It definitely was a period of learning. You have 2 main groups, that are the most common sculptures. The Choros, which was male, and the Chore, which was female. And it just tended to be of men and women. The male figures were almost always nude, and the female figures were always clothed. And this had definitely to do with, again, the view of women in Greece, that women were supposed to be modest and fully covered, and so you certainly didn't show them naked. They were influenced by Egyptian style, and hopefully you will see from the Egyptian art that we looked at the similarities, both in stance, and again we'll go over these as we look at the pictures themselves. The positioning of the arms is very similar. You also have a clear similarities with the shoulder to hip proportions. And so definitely in the Archaic Period there is that Egyptian style and feel to it. The figures don't stand in natural positions, and that's in part to the shoulder to hip proportions. It's also just kind of learning how they could hold the weight, because part of the way to get a natural pose is you actually have to know how to hold the weight. And then you have a general facial. I'm clicking on everything today. General facial expressions. They're kind of neutral. You don't. A lot of stuff isn't individual. It looks much more generalized. And then you also have long braided hair, which is very distinct from the other periods. So that's the Archaic characteristics. The Classical Period. Now the Classical Period, right, this is in Athens. Athens is the one producing this stuff. They're at their height of power. They have shifted to democracy, and so they're looking to express and showcase that within the sculptures themselves. The poses become more naturalistic. And part of that was technique and style that they learned. You definitely have the arete, and we'll look at what that is with it. So young men, the ideal proportions. You have that they're fit, besides young, right? And it's meant to be the best that they potentially can be. So they're very fit. You have ideal proportions, and that they're young, and that's kind of seen as this optimistic, the best that a person can obtain to. The men were nude still, that doesn't really ever change. That you're showcasing off, right? That excellence, that's part of that. There was that the new techniques, the new stances to imitate how humans actually stand and balance. So again, some of that was figuring out the technique to be able to do that. You have much more defined muscles and general anatomy is accurate. You also have more movement that's shown in the classical period. There's clearer facial features. So if you knew the person that was modeling for the statue, you probably would be able to look at the statue and be like, oh, that looks like that person. There was lots with gods and heroes, themes, or myths. There was also a lot with athletes. So that's the classical period. Again, how it fits. Athens is height of power. They're optimistic. They're celebrating this grand sense of democracy and that anyone can achieve greatness. And so you showcase these young, fit men at the height of what a human body and being can be. And stories of the gods and myths and athletics and athletes, it makes sense as that ideal. You emphasize ideal proportions. All of that fits in with what's going on with the classical period. And then the last is the Hellenistic. So the Hellenistic, again, you have Alexander the Great's death and a lot of chaos and turmoil that's taking place. And that's going to be reflected in how some of the changes go. One, you actually start seeing common people. So there's a woman at a market that's old and hunched over, which also goes to realism. Part of the philosophies in the Hellenistic period that emerged with this was also this idea of realism, to show things as they were rather than this false idealized sense. They were even more detailed, if you can imagine, than the classical period. And again, up to the point of where you see people's veins, incredibly detailed with the muscle, with the anatomy, with the structure. There is a huge focus for artists on difficulty. One of these reasons was that because people were wealthier, people were paying for sculptures. And so artists wanted to show off. You don't have that in the classical period as much. And so one of the ways to show off your talent was to showcase difficult things to do. So there is a ton of movement. There is some movement in the classical period. There is a whole new level of emphasis on movement. The other thing was having cloth or clothes, not on the person, but nearby. You'll notice almost every single sculpture in the Hellenistic period will have the person, the male, nude, but they'll always have a cloth next to them because cloth was really hard to do realistically. And so they would put that in just to show like I'm really skilled and I know what I'm doing. And then there was a focus on emotion of the face. And there's this was for difficulty, but it also was because of the Hellenistic period. The main emphasis on the emotional expressions were pain or extreme emotion. So again, think you have a much more pessimistic period because of the fighting, because of the chaos. And that's reflected in the things that they're sculpting. That they're showcasing scenes that showcase pain and an extreme emotion rather than happiness and idealization. You do have idealized sculptures, and proportion. But these are almost always with the gods and myths, right? When they're showing realism, it's with the common person. And there was a ton that showcased gods and myths. What they go away from is the athletics and just people that they're putting in the classical period in this idealized sense. And then you do start to have a shift in women, sometimes partially nude or nude. And this has to do with the fact that women's rights were increasing during the Hellenistic period. So let's take a look at these. Here is the Choros with the Archaic period. And as you can see, right, the long hair, the general basic expression. You'll notice the shoulders, as I mentioned, are longer than the hip ratio, that this is not accurate shoulder to hip ratio. The arms are straight and then kind of in the fist right down by the legs, and then you have that stance with 1 foot forward of the others. This is very much that Egyptian style. So that's the Choros, and then we have the Chore, which was the female version. Same thing, you know, longer hair, one hand. This one hand was holding something, but most of the sculptures you'll see noses or limbs that have been broken away from time, or in some cases when the city of Rome fell, various Germanic tribes, the Visigoths and the Vandals, came and lopped off noses and arms. That's where we get the word vandalize, is from the Vandals, because they went around chopping off noses and arms from statues. But you can see her one arm with the fist down there in a straight pose. The clothing is basic. You don't have not a lot of detail. And that's a key difference between the Archaic and Classical and Hellenistic, is it gets more detailed. This doesn't really look realistic. You can tell it's a dress, but it's pretty. There's not a lot of structure and design to it. And same thing, face pretty straightforward. So the Choros and the Chore were the standard Archaic sculptures. Oops, we're missing a U here. The Discus Thrower. This is the Classical period. This is the best example of the Classical period. You have movement, right? New stance that allows this support beam here is what was created to allow them to have more movement. But you have movement going on. You have a more detailed facial structure. You can see his veins here a little bit too, but all of a sudden the emphasis on the body and the having it be correct. You now have the shoulders and the hips correct in ratio, as well as, again, young and an idealized sense of what a human body can be, as well as an athlete, right? With the discus thrower, that's the athletics. Here is another one, the spear bearer, Classical period. Same kind of thing. You have that base that was discovered to be used. Now here, so the discus thrower, you have a lot more movement going on, right? In how he is positioned. The spear bearer is a good one to compare to the Choros because he's standing upright. But you can see, right, that you have a more natural pose with the arm, even though it's down by his side, it's not in a fist. You have more shorter hair now, more detail to the face. Again, that idealized sense, arete, of the body, as well as more detail that is anatomically correct, both in muscles and shape and structure. That idealized proportion is there. And then the stance of the feet and legs is also more realistic and natural poses. And then for the Hellenistic period, this one here is a story about a king who kills his wife. This is his wife, and then himself by suicide, because they're about to be overrun by an enemy, and rather than be captured, which then his wife would be raped and either killed or enslaved, and he would be tortured and killed, or just killed. He sacrifices in this way so that they have a quick death. So again, it's this intense emotion, but then you also see a lot of movement and shape. You have the cloth on the woman because she's fully clothed. So again, not all women in Hellenistic period were nude. It's just that women were starting to show sometimes nude images of women. But Aphrodite was the number one sculpture of nude. She was the goddess of love, lust, and sex. So it's not surprising that they chose her to showcase that rather than other women. But most women you'll still see. But if you can see how much more detailed the clothing is, and then just the emotion of this myth that the story is telling, and then he has a cape behind him, right, just for the sake of doing so. So because this is that myth and story, you have the idealized proportions, right? You will see in other ones, especially if you're looking at the PowerPoint for the discussion, where there's that realism either of showing children or older women as they are, rather than in an idealized sense. The one that's the best example of Hellenistic period would be Laocoon and his sons. This is also a myth about Laocoon here and his sons being consumed by snakes. This is the best example of hitting all those points. Movement, cloth, right? They're all nude. It's a myth. They're all nude, but they all have cloth draped around. 3 different cloths draped around to showcase difficulty. And besides that, the level of skill that it would take to carve out this snake while they're all in these crazy moving positions is insane. So that whole skill level that's showing off, and then the emotion. If you're looking at the faces again, it's that pain and extreme emotion, which would be the case when you're being suffocated and eaten by giant snakes. But you see that in each of their faces, that there's an emphasis in showing that emotion and detail and such. A very detailed body. You see all the veins, all the muscles in the correct way that they would be showcased in these positions. So that's that extreme jump in the Hellenistic period, but also again, because of the chaos and structure of the Hellenistic period, you tend to get a much more pessimistic view of philosophies, of sculptures, of art that showcases that emotion and pain, and kind of is the idea that the world sucks, so how can we be happy? That's the philosophy part, is it? So yeah, acknowledging that the world sucks, so here's how you be happy. In sculptures, it's acknowledging and examining pain and extreme emotion. But because you have wealthy clients, you also have individual commissions purchasing that want realism and individualism in their sculptures, as well as just examining the real world rather than this what they saw as kind of a false idealized sense of this optimistic world that they don't believe existed that happened in the classical period. So it is important to understand the historical background, because it does help you understand the type of art and why the art's being done the way that it is. All right, so the last thing we have in is just the Roman period, and we only have a few for that. With the Roman art, you have a couple of different periods as well. The Romans, so we're on 6 here. So the Roman art, if we're looking at the history first, just to have a little bit of background, you have 3 periods for the Roman rule as well. The first was the kingdom, which is not talked about a lot, and they didn't produce a lot of art during that period. Then you have the Republic, and then you have the Empire. And so the empire is when emperors were in charge. The republic is when you have a republican government, in that sense of consuls and senate versus a single ruler during the empire. So 753 to 509 BCE. And then you have 509 to 27 BCE, and then 27 to BCE. Well, and if you're going all the way till the Eastern period with the Byzantium, 1453 CE, which we're in CE. They loved Greek culture, but disliked the Greeks. So there was this sense of copying and taking and incorporating aspects of Greek culture, but also making it their own in other ways. They used Greek slaves to be their tutors, their kids' tutors and teachers, because again, they early Roman Republic, most of the wealthy Romans knew Greek. They copied a lot of Greek sculptures, like just straight up plagiarized it. Didn't change anything. They just redid it and said it's mine. So they were big on plagiarizing Greek works, both in art and literature. They did do their own stuff as well. They incorporated the Greek gods, although they also had hundreds and hundreds of their own. So they did change the names to Latin, and then they had their own as well. And so they did have their own values, which are some of the themes, but we'll look at some of the others as well here. With their own values, you had the military, right, which was one of the themes, individualism in art, but more of the Roman civic duty. You had the idea of glory to Rome above all else. And then you had the propaganda in art during the empire. That didn't go on really during the Republic, but with the empire and the emperors. So if we look at the Roman Republic period, because again in the kingdom, they were not really producing their own art at that period in time. They did recognize individual accomplishments. And specifically like to showcase that in art. So again, it was this unique thing of Rome before all else. But where you see that is in lifelike portraits that people often hung up in their homes. You also had death masks that were created, which were meant to replicate the face, and were covered then when they were buried. And then busts were very common. Busts were sculptures, but only from the head to the shoulders. Sometimes maybe to the middle of the chest, but that's as far as they went. The busts were where they showed how they actually looked. So it was meant to be realistic, right? There was not meant to be any kind of idealized sense. And then the family kept these. In fact, they would often have this important aspect of ancestors, mostly of men, and the importance of showing off their ancestors, so that you would have the wealthy. These was largely for the patricians, because they were wealthy enough. The patricians were like the upper class, and the patricians could afford these busts, and so they would have a room with the bust of their ancestors, which they could go look to and remember and share the stories of these important family members. Many of the sculptures would often have them wearing togas. Now, this was a traditional dress for the Senate, so that people didn't go walking around wearing togas all the time in Rome. The Senate was a government position, which was seen as an important part of being Roman. And so they would showcase the men when they did have them in togas as part of that civic duty, right? That you were following and doing your civic duty. The frescoes, which we have actually from Pompeii, what most preserved, but there are some in other regions as well. The wealthy families, again, most of these had, the poor could not afford to do these in their homes. They covered the walls with these fresco paintings, and they were painted. Some were mosaics. You did have occasionally mosaics, and you had a lot of landscapes and scenes that way, as well as myths and the gods. And so these tended to be in individual homes. Put that there. Of the wealthy. They like to have that color and decoration. So that's for the Republic. For the Empire, you have two things we're going to look at. The first is architecture with the main type of architecture and structure, and the Colosseum is what we're really going to look at. So architecture was used a lot, buildings to celebrate military success. So military conquest and success. One really famous one is the Arch of Constantine. But they would build buildings to highlight a military campaign that they were successful in. They also, emperors, right? This is the period with emperors. They would also build temples and dedicate them to showcase, one, it would be to remember the emperor, but it was also it was propaganda to show off that they were pious, right? That they were religious, that they were remembering the people. The Colosseum is probably the most well preserved and known. The Colosseum was a place to hold gladiator games, and it was massive. There were smaller Colosseums and arenas, but the Colosseum was one of the largest. The emperor would hold these gladiator games in order to entertain the people, but it was also to keep them happy in times of issues. What they would do is that they would let them in for free, and then they would give them bread and food, sometimes drink as well, right? It was meant to appease the people. And so you'd have these games, especially if there was, the emperor felt like he wasn't being well loved enough, you'd hold these games to keep people happy and not be discontent. The big Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 people, which was very large for its time. It had 4 different levels. The lower 3 were formed by a series of arches, which the Romans were definitely also a type of architectural design that the Romans perfected and did. That's definitely, if you see architecture that utilizes a lot of arches, That tends to either be Roman or Romanesque, right? Influenced by the Romans. And then everything today is popping up. This was surrounded by columns, and they used all three styles, right? The Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The top layer, right? That was the bottom three of the Colosseum, had a bunch of engraved Corinthian columns. And walls that were engraved as well. And then each level had statues of past emperors, of gods. A lot were the emperors and famous people and actual people in Rome. You had a canvas for a roof that could be retracted or expanded so that it protected the people from the sun, right? Which a retractable roof was pretty impressive. There was a total of 80 entrances, 76 of which were for public use. So you had private entrances for the emperor and some of the Senate and other VIPs. And then you had it underneath a network of tunnels, as well as this was for the people to go through and travel unseen. You also had it connected to an aqueduct where they could actually flood the Colosseum, the arena, and they would stage. So they would move it. The animals were stored underneath in these, and the people. So they would move all of that out, and then they would open up the aqueducts to flood the theater part of the arena for mock naval battles. I mean, it was incredibly impressive architectural design. So we'll take a look at that in just a second, along with the sculptures here. So the last thing is the statues of the emperors. All right, so this was propaganda. They were done to showcase off a specific idea and portrayal of the emperor. They were actually distributed. They would have statues commissioned in multiples, and they would be distributed throughout the empire. Right? So these were very clearly done not to showcase a realistic structure, but to showcase a specific idea. They were often larger than life size, right? To make them seem big and important. They also use the idealized proportion. In fact, they definitely fit under the idea of classical style, and that they were idealized. The emperors were almost always shown as younger, in that sense of perfect proportion. Of that idealized sense of the best possible condition and look and face. They were usually shown with their face to be of that perfect proportion and ideal look. And again, that was to show this sense of strength and structure. Often they were shown both, in military uniform, occasionally, or the toga. Right, and it was to showcase military strength and also their loyalty and emphasis to Rome. Okay, so let's look at these. Here we have the Roman Republic bust. And again, the purpose being realism. So these would be showcased in the family home, and you don't have it's realistic. It's meant to have it look like the actual person. So when you see these busts of the Roman busts, they tend to, here, you can't, he doesn't have, right, the whole clothing because it's just a bust. That is part of a toga. So even on the bust, they're showcasing part of the toga. But again, this is what this person probably looked like. They did keep it accurate. There's no idealized sense. You can tell he's overweight. That's intentional. Here we have what the Roman Colosseum looked like, or what it looks like today. You can see the 3 layers, right? 1, 2, 3, and then the 4th layer, which looks different because you have the walls and the engravings and stuff. In these spaces is where the people, the statues, were all showcased, right? They're not there anymore. They've long been destroyed or removed, but that's where they would have been. Here's the inside with the theater and seating. So you had several levels of seating that took place. And then this was the floor. And then you can see what today, right, they have the underground part here, which had the different rooms. You wouldn't have seen that when this was all nice. And they had pulley systems and trap doors where things could come out from under the floor, tunnels. This would have all been flooded, right, if they had opened up the aqueduct. So incredibly impressive technology. Here's a reconstruction, a design, computer design of what it would have looked like. So you have the retractable canvas roof. Here you can see all the statues. There were hundreds of them all around. And then the inside with all the seating. 3 different levels of seating that took place. So incredibly impressive design. And then here we have Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor. And this was commissioned when he was older. But it's definitely of him as a young, fit soldier. He was not ever described as really well fit. And not that he was fat, he was just scrawny and had issues. So the likelihood of being super muscular, this is that idealized proportion. Both, and then the stance, you've got the toga. Here they've got both. You've got the military garb and you have the toga, not worn properly, but just wrapped around to showcase both military and government structure. These were sent around, and here you have a god, directing him, which was the belief that the gods destined Rome to be great. So it was propaganda, and it was meant to be passed around. They would create these to be displayed in the Roman Empire for people to see, to present a specific message for the Roman people. All right, that's our Greek and Roman art, and we will be talking about the Middle Ages next.